Sarah Bennett pulled into the parking lot of Jefferson County Courthouse at exactly 9:15 a.m. on a bright Tuesday morning. She wasn't dressed like someone who owned half the commercial properties in downtown Jefferson. Instead, she wore simple blue jeans, a plain white shirt, and comfortable walking shoes, her usual attire for property inspections. The morning had started like any other. Sarah had woken up at 5 a.m. in her modest three-bedroom house on the outskirts of town. Despite being worth millions, she preferred living simply. Her mother had taught her that true wealth wasn't about showing off, but about making a difference in the community. As she walked toward the courthouse steps, Sarah couldn't help but smile at the irony of the situation. Just last week, her company had quietly purchased this very building through a private holding corporation. It was her latest acquisition in a plan to improve the city's infrastructure while keeping rent affordable for government offices. The parking ticket in her hand was for a mere $50, received 2 weeks ago when one of the downtown meters had malfunctioned. Sarah had tried calling the clerk's office to explain, but they had insisted she appear in court. She had photos of the broken meter on her phone and all the necessary documentation. It should be a simple matter to resolve. Several people rushed past her on the courthouse steps, most of them wearing suits and carrying briefcases. A few nodded politely, not recognizing her as the owner of numerous buildings they worked in. Sarah preferred it this way. At 35, she had built her real estate empire quietly, letting her work speak for itself rather than broadcasting her success. Inside the courthouse, the air conditioning hit her face with a blast of cold air. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the echo of footsteps bounced off the high ceilings. Sarah checked the notice again. Courtroom 3B, Judge William Harrison presiding. While waiting on the wooden bench outside the courtroom, Sarah observed the people around her. A young mother struggled with a crying baby, an elderly man nervously shuffled through papers, and two teenagers whispered quietly in the corner. She pulled out her phone and reviewed the photos of the broken meter one more time. At precisely 10 a.m., the bailiff opened the courtroom doors. "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Harrison," his voice boomed through the room. Sarah stood with everyone else as a tall, gray-haired man in black robes strode to the bench. Judge Harrison's reputation preceded him, known for being strict, traditional, and, as some whispered, not entirely impartial when it came to certain defendants. Sarah sat quietly through several cases before hers. She watched as Judge Harrison handled each one with varying degrees of patience. He was remarkably gentle with a young white college student who had been caught speeding, but showed visible irritation with a Hispanic man who struggled with English while explaining his traffic violation. Case number 247, Sarah Bennett, parking violation, the clerk finally called out. Sarah walked confidently to the podium, holding her documentation. She noticed Judge Harrison's expression shift slightly as he looked up from his papers and saw her. His eyes narrowed, and his mouth tightened into a thin line. "Miss Bennett," he said, drawing out her name with a hint of condescension, "you're here for a parking violation on Oak Street, dated October 15th. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied politely. "I have evidence that the meter was malfunctioning that day. Several other people had the same." "Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison interrupted, "the citation clearly states that your meter expired at 2:15 p.m. Are you suggesting our city's equipment is faulty?" Sarah tried again. "Your Honor, if you'll just look at these photos." "I have heard enough excuses today." Judge Harrison cut her off again. His voice carried a tone that many in the courtroom recognized. He had already made up his mind. What Judge Harrison didn't know, as he sat high on his bench looking down at Sarah Bennett in her simple clothes, was that this particular case would soon become the talk of Jefferson County. He had no idea that the quiet woman standing before him owned not just this building, but also the ground it stood on, along with many others in the city. Sarah stood calmly, waiting for what would come next. Years of business negotiations had taught her patience. Sometimes she knew you had to let things play out to create real change. The next few minutes would set in motion events that would transform not just Judge Harrison's career, but the entire Jefferson County justice system. Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair, looking down at Sarah with cold eyes. The courtroom was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of papers. Everyone could feel the tension building in the air. "Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "perhaps you don't understand how things work in my courtroom. We don't waste time with excuses about broken meters. He picked up her file and made a show of flipping through it slowly. Sarah remained calm, though her heart was beating faster. She had dealt with people like Judge Harrison before, people who saw what they wanted to see and made quick judgments based on appearance. She tried one more time to explain. Your Honor, I have photos that clearly show. Silence. Judge Harrison's voice boomed through the courtroom. Several people in the audience jumped in their seats. I will not tolerate interruptions in my courtroom. Sarah noticed how different his tone was compared to just 15 minutes ago when he had let a young white man explain his case for nearly 10 minutes. The contrast was striking, and she wasn't the only one who noticed. The court reporter had stopped typing and was watching the scene with concerned eyes. Now then, Judge Harrison continued, this is your third parking violation this year. He looked at her with disapproval, not knowing that the other tickets had already been dismissed when Sarah proved the same meter was broken. Actually, Your Honor, Sarah spoke carefully, those previous citations were dismissed because… Did I give you permission to speak? Judge Harrison's face was turning slightly red. He turned to his clerk. Show me Ms. Bennett's record. The young clerk, Amy, hesitated for a moment. She had seen the dismissal records but seemed afraid to contradict the judge. Sir, the previous citations were… Never mind that. Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively. Ms. Bennett, your continuous disregard for our city's parking laws shows a pattern of disrespect for authority. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few exchanged worried glances. Even the bailiff, who had worked with Judge Harrison for years, looked uncomfortable. Sarah stood straight and dignified. She was used to being underestimated in business meetings, but this was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever faced unfair treatment in this courtroom. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, shuffling papers on his desk. Your casual attitude today shows a lack of respect for this court. He glanced disapprovingly at her jeans and comfortable work shirt, not knowing she had already inspected 3 building sites that morning. The irony of his words wasn't lost on Sarah. She had signed the papers finalizing her purchase of the courthouse building just last week. The deed was probably still sitting on someone's desk in the county clerk's office. Given your history and attitude, Judge Harrison declared, clearly enjoying his moment of authority, I am imposing a fine of $5,000. A gasp went through the courtroom. Even the other court officials looked shocked. The standard fine for a parking violation was $50. This was clearly excessive. Your Honor, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her growing anger, I would like to appeal this decision. Judge Harrison smiled coldly. You have that right, of course. But be aware that filing an appeal will add court costs to your fine. Now, do you have anything else to say before we conclude this matter? Sarah looked around the courtroom. She saw the worried faces of other people waiting for their cases to be heard. She saw the court reporter, who had stopped typing and was staring at her computer screen in disbelief. She saw Amy, the clerk, biting her lip nervously. No, Your Honor, Sarah replied quietly. I believe everything that needs to be said will come out soon enough. Judge Harrison missed the subtle meaning in her words. He was already reaching for his gavel, ready to move on to the next case. Very well. Pay the fine within 30 days or face additional penalties. Next case. As Sarah turned to leave, she caught Emmy, the clerk's eye. The young woman mouthed, I'm sorry, when Judge Harrison wasn't looking. Sarah gave her a small, knowing smile. Walking out of the courtroom, Sarah pulled out her phone. She had a meeting with the county commissioner in exactly 1 hour. A meeting about renovation plans for this very courthouse. Sometimes, she thought, justice works in unexpected ways. The truth about who really owned the courthouse was about to come out, and Judge Harrison's world was about to change forever. Sarah walked down the courthouse hallway, the unfair $5,000 fine notice clutched in her hand. She checked her watch. It was 11:30 a.m., and her meeting with County Commissioner James Thompson was at noon. A small smile played on her lips as she headed toward the courthouse cafeteria to grab a quick coffee. The cafeteria was busy with the usual mix of courthouse employees, lawyers, and visitors. Sarah stood in line, overhearing snippets of conversation about what had just happened in courtroom 3B. Word was spreading fast about Judge Harrison's excessive fine. Did you hear about that parking ticket case? One young lawyer whispered to another. $5,000 for a parking violation? That's insane. Classic Harrison, his colleague replied, shaking his head. He's been getting worse lately. Someone needs to report him to the Judicial Review Board. Sarah paid for her coffee and found a quiet corner table. She pulled out her phone and called her assistant, Michael. Could you bring the courthouse renovation plans to my meeting with Commissioner Thompson? And yes, everything is going exactly as we expected. Meanwhile, back in his chambers, Judge Harrison was feeling quite pleased with himself. He sat in his leather chair, eating the sandwich his secretary had brought him for lunch. A knock on his door interrupted his meal. "Come in," he called out, mouthful of turkey sandwich. Emmy, the court clerk, entered nervously. "Judge Harrison, I think there's something you should know about the Bennett case from this morning." "What about it?" he asked, barely looking up from his desk. "Sir, I checked her record more thoroughly. Those previous tickets were all dismissed with evidence. The meter on Oak Street has been malfunctioning for months. The city's maintenance records confirm it." Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively. "It doesn't matter now. The fine has been set. She'll think twice before disrespecting my courtroom again." Amy hesitated before speaking again. "There's something else, sir. I saw her name on some documents that came through the county clerk's office last week." But before she could finish, Judge Harrison's phone rang. It was the county commissioner's office requesting his presence at a meeting at 12:30 p.m. Something about courthouse renovations, the secretary said. Back in the cafeteria, Sarah finished her coffee just as Michael arrived with a thick folder of blueprints and documents. "Perfect timing," she said, standing up. "Let's head to the commissioner's office." Commissioner Thompson's office was on the top floor of the courthouse, with large windows overlooking the city. When Sarah and Michael entered, Thompson greeted them warmly. "Miss Bennett, so glad you could make it. I've been excited to discuss your plans for improving the building." He gestured for them to sit in the comfortable chairs facing his desk. Sarah spread out the blueprints on the commissioner's large desk. "As you can see, we're planning to modernize while preserving the historical character of the building. The first phase includes updating all the courtrooms with better acoustics and new technology." They were deep in discussion when another knock came at the door. Judge Harrison entered, then stopped short when he saw Sarah sitting there. His face went pale. "Ah, Judge Harrison." Commissioner Thompson said cheerfully, "Perfect timing. I wanted you to meet Ms. Bennett properly. She's the new owner of the courthouse building. She's planning some wonderful improvements to your courtroom." Judge Harrison stood frozen in the doorway. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Sarah turned to face him, her expression professional and composed. "Judge Harrison and I have already met," she said calmly. "In fact, he just fined me $5,000 for a parking violation at a meter that maintenance records show has been broken for months." Commissioner Thompson's eyebrows shot up. $5,000? For a parking ticket? "Yes," Sarah continued, her voice steady. "It was quite an interesting experience seeing how justice is administered in the courthouse I now own." The color drained from Judge Harrison's face as the reality of the situation sank in. The woman he had treated so dismissively less than 2 hours ago wasn't just any citizen. She was his new landlord. "I believe," Sarah added, turning back to the blueprints, "that courtroom 3B will be the first to receive renovations. We'll need to temporarily relocate those proceedings during construction, of course." Judge Harrison remained standing in the doorway, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The day that had started so normally had just taken an unexpected turn, and he had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of his problems. The news spread through the Jefferson County Courthouse like wildfire. By 2 p.m., everyone from the janitors to the senior judges had heard about what happened in Commissioner Thompson's office. The story grew with each retelling. How Judge Harrison had unfairly fined the very woman who owned the building they were all working in. Judge Harrison sat in his chambers, his hands shaking as he poured his third cup of coffee. The morning's events kept replaying in his mind. He had been so quick to judge Sarah Bennett, so sure of his authority, and now everything was falling apart. A knock on his door made him jump. It was Chief Judge Martinez, his supervisor. "Bill, we need to talk," Chief Judge Martinez said, closing the door behind him. His face was serious. "I've received 3 calls in the last hour about what happened this morning. The local news is asking for comments. Judge Harrison slumped in his chair. I didn't know who she was, he said weakly. That's exactly the problem, Martinez replied sharply. You shouldn't treat anyone that way, regardless of who they are. $5,000 for a parking ticket. What were you thinking? Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her downtown office, reviewing emails that were pouring in. Local civil rights organizations wanted to meet with her. Other people who had faced similar treatment in Judge Harrison's courtroom were reaching out to share their stories. Her assistant Michael knocked and entered with a stack of papers. Miss Bennett, the courthouse maintenance records you requested are here. They confirmed the meter on Oak Street has been reported broken 8 times in the past 3 months. Sarah nodded, looking through the documents. And the video footage. Right here, Michael said, placing a USB drive on her desk. The security cameras caught everything in the courtroom. The court reporter also sent over the official transcript. Back at the courthouse, Amy the clerk was busy pulling files from Judge Harrison's previous cases. She had been keeping notes for months, worried about the pattern she saw in his rulings. Now finally, someone might actually listen. Judge Harrison's secretary knocked on his door again. Sir, there's a reporter from the Jefferson Daily News on line 1. They're running a story about this morning's incident. Tell them no comment, he snapped, then immediately regretted his harsh tone. He was starting to realize how often he spoke to people this way. At 3:30 p.m., Sarah had another meeting, this time with her lawyers. They sat in her conference room, reviewing the morning's events. The fine was clearly excessive, her lead attorney said. But more importantly, we found a pattern of similar behavior in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The data shows significant disparities in how he treats different defendants based on race and appearance. Sarah looked out her office window at the courthouse building across the street. This isn't about revenge, she said thoughtfully. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Back in his chambers, Judge Harrison received another visitor, his old friend and fellow judge, Robert Chen. Bill, Judge Chen said, sitting down heavily, I've been your friend for 20 years. I need to be honest with you. What happened today, it's not an isolated incident. We've all seen how you treat certain defendants differently. Judge Harrison started to protest, but Judge Chen held up his hand. Listen to me. This is your wake-up call. You can either learn from it, or it could be the end of your career. By late afternoon, Sarah received a call from Commissioner Thompson. Miss Bennett, the Judicial Review Board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They're requesting your presence. I'll be there, Sarah replied. And Commissioner? Please make sure Judge Harrison knows that my plans for renovating his courtroom haven't changed. Sometimes, the best way to fix a broken system is from the inside out. As the sun set over Jefferson County, both Sarah and Judge Harrison sat in their respective offices, thinking about the day's events. For Sarah, it was another step in her quiet mission to improve her community. For Judge Harrison, it was the beginning of a painful but necessary lesson about justice, prejudice, and the consequences of judging a book by its cover. The real changes were just beginning, and tomorrow would bring even more surprises for everyone involved. The next morning, the Jefferson County Judicial Review Board met in their conference room on the top floor of the courthouse. 7 members sat around a large oak table, with Chairman David Roberts at the head. The room was tense as they waited for Sarah Bennett to arrive. At exactly 9 a.m., Sarah walked in, dressed professionally in a navy blue suit. This time, there was no mistaking her position of authority. Her lawyer, Jennifer Martinez, walked beside her, carrying a thick folder of documents. Thank you for coming, Ms. Bennett, Chairman Roberts said, gesturing to an empty chair. We've called this emergency meeting to address yesterday's incident and some broader concerns that have come to light. Just then, Amy, the court clerk, entered with a cart full of files. These are all the cases from Judge Harrison's courtroom over the past year, she explained, her voice shaking slightly. I've been keeping track of the patterns. The board members looked at the mountain of files with concern. Sarah's lawyer stood up and began distributing reports she had prepared. What you're receiving, Jennifer explained, is a statistical analysis of Judge Harrison's rulings over the past 12 months. The data shows clear patterns of bias in his sentencing. Chairman Roberts put on his reading glasses and studied the first page. His frown deepened. According to these numbers, Judge Harrison gives fines averaging 200% higher to minorities compared to white defendants for the same violations. Down in his chambers, Judge Harrison sat alone, waiting. He hadn't slept well, spending most of the night thinking about his actions. His phone kept ringing with calls from reporters, but he ignored them all. Sarah's voice was calm as she addressed the board. Yesterday's incident with my parking ticket isn't just about me. It's about every person who has walked into that courtroom and faced unfair treatment. The board members listened as Sarah played the security footage from the previous day. They watched Judge Harrison's dismissive behavior, his interruptions, and his excessive fine. Then they watched footage from other cases, showing the stark difference in how he treated different defendants. "This is disturbing," board member Janet Chen said, shaking her head. "But what's even more concerning is that it went unchecked for so long." Amy stepped forward again. "Many of us noticed, but we were afraid to speak up. Judge Harrison has a lot of influence here." In the middle of the meeting, Commissioner Thompson arrived with more evidence. "We've reviewed the maintenance records for that parking meter," he announced. It was reported broken multiple times. Judge Harrison had access to this information, but chose to ignore it. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city below. "I'm not here to demand Judge Harrison's removal," she said, surprising everyone. "I'm here to propose a solution." She turned back to face the board. "As the owner of this building, I have plans for renovations. But maybe we need to renovate more than just the physical structure. Maybe we need to change how justice is administered here." The board members exchanged glances. Chairman Roberts leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Bennett?" "A complete overhaul of the system," Sarah replied. "Mandatory bias training for all court officials, regular review of sentencing patterns, and a new community oversight committee. I'm willing to fund these programs myself." The room was quiet as everyone considered her words. Finally, board member Michael Wong spoke up. "We should also review all of Judge Harrison's recent cases. Some people might deserve refunds or appeals." "Agreed," Sarah nodded. "And I want to be part of that process." As the meeting continued, word spread through the courthouse about what was happening. Employees gathered in small groups, discussing the changes that might be coming. Some were nervous, but many felt hopeful. By noon, the board had reached several decisions. Judge Harrison would be temporarily suspended pending a full investigation. All his recent cases would be reviewed. And most importantly, Sarah's proposed reforms would be implemented. As Sarah left the meeting, she passed Judge Harrison's empty courtroom. Through the window, she could see his vacant judge's chair. Sometimes, she thought, the biggest changes start with the smallest incidents, like a simple parking ticket. The real work was just beginning, and Jefferson County Courthouse would never be the same again. Judge William Harrison sat alone in his home study, staring at the suspension letter from the Judicial Review Board. The morning newspaper lay on his desk, its headline screaming, "Local judge under investigation. Years of biased rulings exposed." His phone had been ringing nonstop for the past 2 days, but he hadn't answered a single call. His wife, Linda, knocked gently on the study door before entering with a cup of coffee. "Bill," she said softly, "you need to eat something. You've been sitting here since yesterday." He looked up at his wife of 30 years, seeing the concern in her eyes. "How did I not see it, Linda?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, I thought I was being fair." Linda sat down across from him. "Remember what your father used to say about Judge Matthews back in the 60s? How he treated your Irish immigrant grandparents in his courtroom." The memory hit Judge Harrison hard. His grandfather had lost his small business because of Judge Matthews' unfair ruling. He had promised himself he would never be that kind of judge, yet here he was, decades later, doing the same thing to others. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Amy the clerk was working late, helping the review team go through Judge Harrison's old cases. Each file told a story of subtle bias, higher fines for minorities, stricter sentences, less patience during hearings. "Look at this one," Amy said to Jennifer Martinez, Sarah's lawyer. "A young black man got 6 months for the same offense that a white college student got community service for just last month." Sarah Bennett walked into the room, carrying takeout dinner for the team. "How many cases have we reviewed so far?" "Over 200, Jennifer replied, rubbing her tired eyes. "The pattern is clear in almost every one. Back at his house, Judge Harrison finally decided to watch the security footage from his courtroom that the board had provided. For 6 hours straight, he watched himself in case after case. He saw his expressions, heard his tone, noticed his different treatment of defendants based on their appearance and race. In one video, he watched himself interrupt a Hispanic mother trying to explain her situation, while in the next case, he listened patiently to a white businessman for nearly 20 minutes. The contrast was painful to watch. Late that evening, Judge Harrison's daughter Rachel, a law student, came to visit. She found him still in his study, surrounded by case files he had brought home. "Dad," she said, sitting next to him, "my professor used one of your cases as an example in class today. Not in a good way." He looked at his daughter, seeing the disappointment in her eyes. "I've let you down, haven't I?" "You can still make it right," Rachel replied. "But first, you have to truly understand what you did wrong." At the same time, Sarah sat in her office, reviewing the proposed changes for the courthouse. The blueprints for physical renovations now included plans for a new community justice center where judges would receive regular training on bias and fair treatment. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Linda Harrison, the judge's wife. "Miss Bennett, my husband would like to meet with you. Not to make excuses, but to listen and learn. Would you be willing to give him that chance?" Sarah stared at the message for a long time. This wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about creating real change. Sometimes that meant giving people a chance to learn from their mistakes. She typed her reply. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., at my office. Tell him to bring the notes he's surely been making while reviewing his cases." That night, both Sarah and Judge Harrison lay awake in their respective homes, thinking about the meeting ahead. For Sarah, it was another step toward her goal of improving the justice system. For Judge Harrison, it was a chance to begin making amends for years of unconscious bias. The next day would bring either the beginning of real change or the final end of Judge Harrison's career. Everything depended on what he had learned from his time of reflection and whether he was truly ready to change. The transformation of Jefferson County's justice system was about to enter its next phase. At exactly 9 a.m., Judge William Harrison stood outside Sarah Bennett's office building. His hands were shaking as he held a thick notebook filled with his observations from reviewing his past cases. He had barely slept, spending most of the night writing down every instance of bias he had discovered in his rulings. The security guard at the front desk looked at him with recognition. "Miss Bennett is expecting you, Judge Harrison, 15th floor." The elevator ride felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, Sarah's assistant Michael greeted him. "Please follow me, Judge Harrison. Miss Bennett is ready to see you." Sarah's office was simple but elegant, with large windows overlooking the courthouse where Judge Harrison had worked for 20 years. She stood as he entered, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison said, his voice humbler than anyone had ever heard it. "I know I don't deserve your time." Sarah studied him carefully. The arrogant judge from a few days ago was gone. In his place sat a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his realizations. "Judge Harrison," Sarah began, "I didn't agree to this meeting to hear apologies. I want to hear what you've learned from reviewing your cases." He opened his notebook with trembling hands. I spent the last 3 days watching videos from my courtroom and reading through my old cases. The patterns are clear now. I was harder on minorities, quicker to interrupt them, less likely to believe their explanations." Sarah listened without interrupting as Judge Harrison went through specific cases. He had written down names, dates, and details of where his bias had affected his decisions. "There was Maria Rodriguez," he said, his voice cracking. "She tried to explain that she was late to court because her child was in the hospital. I fined her $500 for contempt. The very next day, I accepted a similar excuse from a white defendant without question." Tears formed in his eyes as he continued. "And James Washington, a young black man who got 6 months for a minor offense that I usually gave community service for. These are just 2 examples out of hundreds." Sarah took out her own folder. "We've been reviewing those cases too, Judge Harrison. What do you think should be done about them?" "They all deserve new hearings," he replied without hesitation. "And I've written personal letters to each person I treated unfairly, admitting my bias and apologizing. They're all in this folder." He placed another thick envelope on her desk. Sarah raised her eyebrows, genuinely surprised. She hadn't expected him to take such initiative. But that's not enough, Judge Harrison continued. I want to do more. I've enrolled in bias training courses, and I'm working with civil rights organizations to better understand the impact of systemic racism in our justice system. For the first time since the meeting began, Sarah smiled slightly. That's a good start, Judge Harrison. But what about the future? What happens when you return to the bench? Judge Harrison straightened in his chair. If I'm allowed to return, I want to implement a system where all my rulings are reviewed monthly for bias. I want to work with community leaders to understand their perspectives. And, he paused, taking a deep breath, I want to mentor young judges to help them avoid making the same mistakes I did. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking at the courthouse. Judge Harrison, when I bought that building, I didn't just buy property. I bought an opportunity to create change. Your situation has given us a chance to transform the entire system. She turned back to face him. I'm willing to support your return to the bench, under certain conditions. You'll work with our new Community Oversight Committee. You'll participate in regular bias training. And most importantly, you'll help us implement these changes across the entire courthouse. Judge Harrison nodded eagerly. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Good, Sarah said, because this isn't just about you anymore. It's about creating a justice system that truly serves everyone equally. As Judge Harrison left Sarah's office that morning, he felt both humbled and hopeful. He had been given a second chance, not just to save his career, but to help create real change in the system he had served for so long. The transformation had begun, both in Judge Harrison and in the Jefferson County justice system. 3 months had passed since the meeting between Sarah Bennett and Judge Harrison. The Jefferson County Courthouse was a different place now. Workers were busy renovating the building, but the biggest changes weren't in the walls. They were in the people. On this particular morning, Judge Harrison stood before a packed courtroom, but he wasn't sitting on the bench. Instead, he was teaching a group of judges, lawyers, and court staff about recognizing unconscious bias. Last year, I would have denied having any prejudice, he said to the attentive audience. But let me show you exactly how bias can creep into our decisions without us even knowing it. In the back of the room, Sarah watched with satisfaction. The man speaking was nothing like the arrogant judge who had fined her 3 months ago. His hair had more gray now, but his eyes showed wisdom that hadn't been there before. Emmy, the court clerk, raised her hand. Judge Harrison, what's the biggest change you've noticed in yourself since the training began? Harrison smiled thoughtfully. I listen more. Really listen. Yesterday, a young man came in for a traffic violation. In the past, I would have rushed through his explanation. Instead, I learned he was driving his sick mother to chemotherapy. That context mattered. Meanwhile, in another part of the courthouse, the new Community Oversight Committee was meeting. The committee, created by Sarah, included people from all parts of the community, teachers, social workers, former defendants, and civil rights activists. The numbers are encouraging. Jennifer Martinez, Sarah's lawyer, reported to the committee. In the past 3 months, we've reviewed over 500 old cases. More than 200 people have received refunds for excessive fines, and 50 cases have been reopened for new hearings. Back in the training session, Judge Harrison was showing video clips from his old court sessions, comparing them with recent ones. The difference was striking. Watch how I interrupted this woman 6 times in 2 minutes, he said, pointing to an old video. Now watch a similar case from last week. The defendant speaks freely, and justice is better served because of it. During the lunch break, Sarah met with Commissioner Thompson in the new Courthouse Cafe, another of her improvements to the building. The changes you and Judge Harrison have made are spreading, Thompson said excitedly. 3 other courthouses in the state have asked about implementing similar training programs. Sarah nodded, stirring her coffee. That's good news, but we're just getting started. Next week, we're launching the Youth Justice Program. The Youth Justice Program was Sarah's latest initiative. It would bring high school students into the courthouse to learn about the legal system and participate in mock trials. Judge Harrison had volunteered to lead the program. Later that afternoon, a familiar face appeared in Judge Harrison's new courtroom. Maria Rodriguez, the woman he had unfairly fined months ago. This time, she was there to join the Community Oversight Committee. "Welcome, Mrs. Rodriguez," Harrison said warmly, stepping down from the bench to greet her. "Your perspective will be invaluable to our committee." Maria looked surprised at his friendly manner. "Thank you, Judge Harrison. My English is still not perfect, but—" "Your English is fine," he assured her. "And we now have court translators available whenever needed. That's one of the many changes Ms. Bennett helped us implement." At the end of the day, Sarah walked through the courthouse, observing all the changes. The walls had fresh paint, but more importantly, the halls were filled with new faces. People from all parts of the community who now felt welcome in their courthouse. She passed by Judge Harrison's courtroom one last time. He was still there, reviewing cases with a young law student intern. "Remember," she heard him say, "justice isn't just about following the law. It's about seeing the human being in front of you." Sarah smiled to herself. The parking ticket that had started all this was framed in her office now, a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments. As she left the building, she saw a group of community members entering for the evening's public forum, another new initiative. The courthouse was no longer just a building where justice was served. It had become a center for community transformation. The story of the judge and the courthouse owner had become a symbol of change, not just in Jefferson County, but in courthouses across the state. Sometimes, true justice starts with one person willing to learn from their mistakes and another person willing to give them that chance. 1 year had passed since the day Sarah Bennett walked into Judge Harrison's courtroom for a simple parking ticket. The Jefferson County Courthouse was celebrating its first anniversary of the Justice Reform Program, and the main hall was filled with people from all walks of life. Sarah stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. In the front row sat Judge Harrison with his family, alongside Maria Rodriguez, Amy the clerk, and many others who had been part of this incredible journey. "A year ago," Sarah began, her voice clear and strong, "I walked into this courthouse as just another person with a parking ticket. Today, we stand here celebrating something much bigger than any one person or incident." The walls of the courthouse told their own story. New signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors. The halls displayed artwork from local artists, showing scenes of justice and community. Every courtroom now had translation services and cultural sensitivity advisors. Judge Harrison, now serving as the head of judicial training, stood up to speak next. He looked different from a year ago, more humble, more approachable, and definitely more wise. "Last year, I made a mistake that could have ended my career," he said honestly. "Instead, thanks to Ms. Bennett's vision, it became an opportunity to create real change. We've helped other people learn from my mistakes." The numbers spoke for themselves. Posted on a large board were the year's achievements. 1,000 cases reviewed and corrected. 300 judges and court staff trained in bias awareness. 50 community programs launched. 5 other courthouses adopting their reform model. 0 complaints of racial bias in the past 6 months. Maria Rodriguez stepped up to share her story next. "A year ago, I was afraid to come to this courthouse," she said, her English much improved. "Now I help other people feel welcome here. This is what real justice looks like." Amy, who had been promoted to Chief Court Administrator, presented the next phase of their programs. "Starting next month, we're opening the Youth Justice Academy. High school students will learn about law and justice from Judge Harrison and other reform judges." In the audience, local news reporters took notes. The Jefferson County Courthouse had become a national model for justice reform. Visitors from other states regularly came to learn from their example. Sarah watched as Judge Harrison's daughter Rachel, now a newly graduated lawyer, talked about the legal clinic she was opening in the courthouse. It would provide free legal help to people who couldn't afford lawyers. "My father's experience taught our whole family about the importance of fair justice," Rachel said. "Now I want to help make sure everyone has access to it." Near the end of the ceremony, a surprise visitor arrived, the mayor of Jefferson City. He carried an official proclamation declaring this day Justice Reform Day in the city. "What happened in this courthouse over the past year proves that change is possible," the mayor announced. "One parking ticket led to a complete transformation of our justice system." Judge Harrison walked over to Sarah, holding something in his hands. It was a framed copy of the original $5,000 fine he had given her. "I keep this in my chambers," he said quietly. It reminds me every day to look past my assumptions and see the real person standing before me. Sarah smiled and pulled out her own copy of the same ticket, which she had framed in her office. Sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected places, she replied. As the celebration continued, people shared stories of how the courthouse had changed their lives. A young man talked about getting a second chance through the new rehabilitation program. A grandmother described how the new translation services helped her family navigate the legal system. The day ended with a community dinner in the courthouse plaza. People from all backgrounds sat together, sharing food and stories. Judge Harrison sat with Maria Rodriguez's family, learning Spanish from her children. Sarah watched it all from a quiet corner, feeling proud of what they had accomplished. The parking ticket that had started it all was now just a memory, but its impact would continue for generations to come. The Jefferson County Courthouse had become more than just a building. It was a symbol of how justice, when truly blind to color and status, could transform an entire community. As the sun set on the celebration, Sarah knew that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in their ongoing journey toward true justice for all.